The world, for Ethan, was a small, dark room padded with black acoustic foam. It was his sanctuary, his studio, his confessional. Here, in the sterile blue light of his monitor, he spun tales of psychological decay for his podcast, The Echo Chamber. His voice, a carefully modulated baritone, was his only instrument. He spoke into the high-end microphone, the words flowing with a charm.
Julian traced the condensation on the window pane.
He narrated, his voice a near whisper.
The city lights blurred into a smear of indifferent gold. He wasn't just looking for a killer anymore. He was looking for the edges of his own mind, terrified he'd find they had dissolved long ago.
He clicked, "Stop," the silence rushing back in to fill the space his voice had occupied. A satisfied sigh escaped him. That was a good take. Episode 37, The Smear of Gold, was in the can. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking a complaint. The ritual was always the same: record, edit, and then the reward, the comments. His podcast was niche, a slow-burn thriller that favored atmosphere over action. His audience was small but fiercely loyal. He scrolled through the new comments on last week's episode, the usual praise, the theories, the critiques. And then he saw the username that had become his focal point: Cassandra_reads. Another masterpiece, Ethan. The symbolism of the recurring rain isn't just about cleansing, as some suggest. It's about dilution. Julian feels his own identity being washed away, becoming indistinguishable from the madness he's investigating. Chilling. Ethan felt a familiar prickle of pleasure. This listener, Cassandra, was different. They didn't just listen, they dissected. They saw the threads he wove, even the ones he hadn't consciously placed. He'd used the rain as a simple, pathetic fallacy, a moody backdrop. But dilution? Yes, that was better. That was exactly what he'd meant, even if he hadn't known it. Over the next few weeks, his ritual changed. He'd post an episode and wait, not for the general feedback, but for that one specific comment. Cassandra_reads never failed him. They praised his pacing, deconstructed his metaphors, and highlighted character motivations with an unnerving clarity. The flattery soon began to curdle into something else. On episode 40, a comment appeared that stopped him cold. The tremor in Julian's hand when he picks up the photograph. It's not just fear, it's recognition. A part of him knows he's seen that victim before, in a place he refuses to remember. You convey so much in that single, silent beat. You must understand buried trauma quite well. Ethan's own hand, resting on his mouse, felt suddenly unsteady. He'd added the detail of the tremor on a whim, an actor's choice in his own vocal performance. He hadn't assigned it any specific meaning beyond general anxiety. And the last line, "You must understand buried trauma quite well." It felt less like an observation about the story and more like one about him. He thought of his own tightly locked past, the things he never spoke of, the very things that fueled the shadows in his stories. It was a lucky guess. It had to be. He tried to shake it off, to see it as the mark of a deeply engaged fan. He was a storyteller. Of course, he poured parts of himself into his work. Anyone could see that. But Cassandra didn't just see it. They held it up to the light. By episode 42, his fascination had soured into a quiet obsession. He found himself writing for Cassandra, trying to create twists they couldn't possibly predict, weaving webs so intricate they would be impossible to untangle. He was losing. Every time, a few hours after an episode went live, the comment would appear, calmly and correctly, identifying the hidden clue, the subtle foreshadowing, the secret heart of the narrative. It felt less like analysis and more like a fact check.
"It's like they're reading my notes,"
he muttered one evening, pacing the confines of his small Los Angeles apartment. The city hummed outside, a vast, sprawling creature oblivious to the war being waged inside his head. He needed to win. He needed to prove that he was the author, the architect, the god of this small, dark world he had created. He sat down at his desk, determined. Episode 43 would be the one. He had the plot mapped out. Julian, closing in on the killer, would be betrayed by his trusted partner, Maria. It was a solid, if slightly conventional, twist, but it wasn't enough. It was predictable. Cassandra would see it coming a mile away. He stared at the blank document, the cursor blinking like a patient black heartbeat. What would be truly unexpected? What would break the pattern? He closed his eyes, sinking into the story. He thought of Julian, of his paranoia, his isolation. Maria was his rock, his only connection to reality. And then the idea struck him. It arrived not as a whisper, but as a bolt of lightning, a flash of pure, exhilarating inspiration that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Maria wasn't a traitor. Maria wasn't real. She was a hallucination, a tulpa, a manifestation of Julian's guilt over a long-dead sister, given form and voice by his fracturing mind. Every conversation, every clue she'd provided had been Julian talking to himself, the ultimate echo in his empty chamber. A giddy, triumphant laugh escaped Ethan's lips. It was perfect, devastating. There was no foreshadowing, no clues, because the deception was not in the plot, but in the very foundation of the narrative. He hadn't written a single word of it, but the entire episode laid itself out in his mind, fully formed and glorious. He had done it. He had finally created something that no one could have seen coming. His phone buzzed on the desk beside him, a notification from his podcast host. He smiled, assuming it was a routine comment on last week's episode. He picked it up, his thumb swiping across the screen, his mind still soaring with creative victory. The notification was for a new comment on episode 42. The username was Cassandra_Reads. Ethan's smile froze. He read the words, and the triumphant heat in his chest turned instantly to ice. The air in the room grew thick and cold, and the blinking cursor on the blank page seemed to mock him, its rhythm now a slow, ominous countdown. The comment was short. A brave choice, making Maria a ghost all along, the perfect echo in his empty chamber. Can't wait to hear how you write it. The glow of the monitor painted Ethan's face in a sickly blue light. Outside his soundproofed studio window, the sprawling nebula of Los Angeles was a silent, indifferent audience. For 3 nights, he had done nothing but stare at the comment, a single sentence left by the user, Listener 734. I bet he finds the locket in the grandfather clock, a classic, but effective. It was a prediction for his latest episode, a story about a man searching his ancestral home for a lost heirloom. The comment had appeared an hour after the episode went live. The problem was, Ethan had only written the scene with the locket and the clock that very afternoon. He hadn't recorded it. He hadn't even read it aloud. It existed only as a string of code in a document on his private hard drive. A coincidence. It had to be. He told himself that 100 times, the words a flimsy mantra against a rising tide of unease. He scrolled back through Listener 734's history. For months, the comments had been a source of validation, sharp, analytical praise that saw the architecture beneath his stories. The unreliable narrator in Echo Chamber isn't just lying to the audience, he's lying to himself. Brilliant. The use of diegetic sound in The Weeping Willow to foreshadow the flood was masterful. The fan had understood his work on a level no one else did. It had been flattering. Now it felt like being observed under a microscope. The praise was no longer a gift, it was an assessment. His studio, once a sanctuary of creativity, now felt like an interrogation room where he was both the suspect and the one asking the questions. He ran a hand through his hair, the silence of the room amplifying the frantic thrum of his own heart. His phone buzzed on the desk, a text from his girlfriend, Maya. "Still up? You're living in that booth, E. Talk tomorrow." He typed back a quick, non-committal reply. "Just finishing up. Talk soon." He couldn't explain this. How could he say he was terrified of a fan's lucky guess without sounding unhinged? The isolation was a wall of glass he was building around himself, and he could see the concerned world on the other side, growing smaller and more distant. A week later, the email arrived. The sender was an indecipherable string of letters and numbers. The subject line was chillingly simple. "For your ears only." Attached was a single audio file, feedback.wav. Ethan's blood ran cold. This was it, the next step. His hand trembled as he reached for his Sennheiser headphones, the professional-grade cans he used for final edits. He slid them over his ears, and the world fell away, replaced by an immediate, expectant silence. His thumb hovered over the mouse. This was a boundary. Once he clicked, he couldn't unhear whatever was on the other side. He clicked. First, a hiss of digital static, like breath held too long. Then a voice cleared its throat. And Ethan stopped breathing. The voice was his own. It wasn't an impersonation. It wasn't a clever deepfake. It was him. It had his exact timbre, the slight West Coast cadence he tried to suppress, the almost imperceptible lisp on his sibilance. It was the voice he heard in his own head, the voice that spoke his stories into existence.
You always tap your left thumb against the microphone stand before you press record.
The voice said, a calm, conversational whisper.
1, 2, 3 taps. A little ritual. A prayer to the gods of sound. But who are you really praying to, Ethan? Who do you hope is listening?
He ripped the headphones from his head and threw them onto the desk, their cord tangling around his keyboard. A wave of nausea washed over him. He stumbled back, his chair rolling into the wall with a dull thud. He checked his own recent recording sessions, his outtakes, his deleted files. Nothing. The audio was clean, original. It had been created, not stolen. He had never spoken those words. The sentence was an intimate observation of a habit so subconscious he hadn't even been aware of it himself. Until now. His own voice had been stolen, repurposed, and used to narrate his own private reality back to him. He couldn't work. For days, the studio remained dark. The microphone stood like a silent accuser on his desk. Every idea he had felt contaminated, as if listener 734 was already there in his mind, waiting for the thought to form so it could be judged. He was a storyteller who had lost the thread of his own narrative. Finally, driven by the pressure of his release schedule and a desperate need to reclaim his own mind, he forced himself to write. He unplugged his router, worked on a fresh document, and poured all his fear and paranoia into a new story. He called it The Marionette's Lament, a dark fable about a master puppeteer who begins to suspect his prized creations are moving on their own, their wooden limbs twitching with a life he did not give them. He wrote through the night, a frantic, feverish burst of creation. The ending came to him in a flash of insight. The puppeteer, in a moment of horror, looks down at his own hands and sees the faint, shimmering strings leading up into the darkness above him. He was never the master. He was just another puppet. Exhausted, Ethan saved the script to his desktop and collapsed into a dreamless sleep. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a notification. A new comment on his last published episode. From listener 734. Ethan's hands were slick with sweat as he unlocked the screen. The words seemed to burn through the glass. The marionette metaphor is a bit on the nose, don't you think? Still, the ending where the puppeteer realizes he's the one with strings attached. That's a nice touch. Can't wait to hear you record it. The phone slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the hardwood floor. This was not a guess. This was not a leak. This was an impossibility. The script existed in one place in the entire world, a single file on a computer that had been disconnected from the internet. The paranoia that had been a creeping fog now solidified into a shard of ice in his chest. He was being watched. No, it was more than that. He was being read. His thoughts, his words, his very soul laid bare for an unseen observer. The fear was suffocating, but beneath it, something else sparked. A hot, defiant flicker of anger. He was not a character. He was not a puppet. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years.
Ben? It's Ethan.
He said, his voice tight, strained.
Man, it's been a while. Everything okay? You sound weird.
I need a favor, a big one.
Ethan said, pacing the length of his apartment.
I need you to trace an IP address. No questions asked. Can you do it?
There was a pause on the other end of the line.
Trace an IP? Ethan, what kind of trouble are you in?
The kind you read about in thrillers, Ben. Just, please.
Another silence, longer this time. Then a sigh.
Okay, send me what you've got. But you owe me an explanation. A long one.
You'll get it, I promise.
Ethan promised, his voice low and intense. He hung up and immediately forwarded the metadata from listener 734's last comment. Then he stood in the center of his sunlit living room, staring at his reflection in the dark screen of his television. The man staring back was a stranger, pale, haunted, with eyes that held the frantic energy of a cornered animal. The game was no longer about telling stories. It was about surviving one. And as he waited for the digital breadcrumb trail to lead him to his tormentor, he knew he was no longer just the narrator. He was the protagonist, stepping out of the sound booth and into the terrifying unknown plot. Ben sent a location pin, and Ethan stared at it, his thumb hovering, a faint tremor running through his hand before he finally tapped it. The map opened to a point deep inside Angeles National Forest. Remote, too remote, and when he hit directions it showed 30 miles. Not bad, still early, he thought. And before he could second-guess himself, Ethan grabbed his keys and headed out. The GPS signal flickered, then died, leaving Ethan with nothing but a static map and the memory of a single red pin. He was deep in the Angeles National Forest now, where the asphalt had crumbled to gravel and the pines grew so thick they blotted out the afternoon sun. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The IP address had felt like a weapon at first, a tool to unmask the ghost haunting his podcast, the anonymous commenter who called themselves listeners. But as the city fell away, replaced by miles of winding, empty road, the feeling had soured into something closer to dread. This wasn't a hunt anymore. It felt like a summons. He finally saw it, set back from the road and half swallowed by overgrown chaparral. A derelict A-frame house, its windows like vacant eyes. The wood was bleached gray by the sun and streaked with black from years of rain. A "no trespassing" sign, riddled with rust and bullet holes, hung crookedly from a single nail on a skeletal fence post. This was the source of the IP address. This was Listener X's lair. It was a place where things went to be forgotten. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach, but the obsession that had driven him for weeks was stronger. He had to know. Parking his car behind a thicket of manzanita, he got out, the silence of the forest pressing in on him. The only sound was the dry whisper of wind through the pines and the frantic thumping of his own heart. He circled the house, his sneakers crunching on dead leaves. The front door was boarded shut. He found a side window, its glass long gone, a grimy sheet of plywood tacked loosely over the frame. With a grunt of effort, he pried it loose. The wood groaned in protest, the sound unnervously loud in the quiet air. He peered into the darkness, the smell of dust, mildew, and something else, something metallic and sterile, wafting out. He hesitated for only a moment, then swung his legs over the sill and dropped inside. The interior was a tomb of forgotten life. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the thin shafts of light, piercing the gloom. An overturned sofa, its floral-patterned guts spilling onto the floor, lay in the center of the main room. A fine layer of gray dust coated every surface, a shroud over a life abandoned mid-sentence. Ethan moved cautiously, his phone's flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the shadows. The house was empty, stripped of personal effects, save for the derelict furniture. It felt hollow, a mere shell. Except for one door at the end of a short hallway, it was different from the others. It was newer, solid-core pine, with a modern brushed nickel handle. It didn't belong. His breath hitched. With a trembling hand, he turned the knob. It was unlocked. The air that flowed out was cool and clean, a stark contrast to the decay in the rest of the house. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. And then he froze, a gasp caught in his throat. He was standing in his own recording studio. It was impossible, a hallucination born of stress and isolation, yet it was real. There was the soundproofed foam on the walls, the same charcoal gray acoustic panels he'd painstakingly installed himself. There was the desk, an identical slab of reclaimed wood he'd bought from a craftsman in Silver Lake. And on the desk, there was his microphone, the Shure SM7B, resting in its shock mount. His headphones, the Beyerdynamic DT770s, hung from a hook on the side of the desk. Even the coffee stain on his mouse pad, shaped vaguely like the state of Texas, was perfectly replicated on the one here.
No,
He whispered, the sound swallowed by the insulated walls.
no, this isn't possible.
He stumbled forward, his hand tracing the edge of the desk. It was real, solid. He saw the audio interface, the same model as his, its power light a single glowing red eye in the dimness. It was connected to a sleek black computer tower, humming quietly beneath the desk. The monitor was dark, asleep. He reached out, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely control them, and tapped the spacebar. The screen flickered to life, displaying a clean, minimalist desktop. There was only one icon on it, a folder labeled The Listener's Echo. His heart hammered against his ribs. He double-clicked. The folder opened to reveal a list of audio files that stretched on, hundreds of them. His blood ran cold as he read the names. Episode 74, The Shadow in the Glass. Episode 75, The Man Who Forgot His Face. Episode 76, The Key Under the Tongue. They were his episodes, all of them. He scrolled down, his eyes scanning the dates. They were all there, stretching back years. Then he saw last week's episode, the one Listener X had given feedback on before it was even finished. He clicked on it. His own voice filled the silent room, narrating the story of the amnesiac clockmaker. The cadence, the inflections, the slight pause he always took before a reveal. It was him. It was the master file, the raw recording before he'd added music or effects. He frantically scrolled further down the list. The dates continued past today, into next week, next month, into 2025, 2026, 2027.
What the hell is this?
He breathed, clicking on a file dated 3 months in the future.
Episode 132, The Girl Who Dreamed in Reverse.
His voice filled the room again, calm and measured, telling a story he had never conceived of. It was a brilliant, intricate tale about a young woman whose dreams moved backward in time, allowing her to solve her own future murder. It was a story he would have written. The themes, the psychological depth, the signature twist at the end. It was his style, perfected. A wave of vertigo washed over him. He wasn't the creator. He was a conduit, a puppet. All his ideas, his flashes of inspiration, his late-night writing sessions, had they ever been his? Or had he simply been receiving them from this place, this impossible house in the woods? He scrolled to the very bottom of the list, his mind numb with a horror that was too vast to comprehend. There was one last file. Its title was simple, stark. Episode 472, The House of Future Echoes. The date next to it was today, now. His gaze fell upon the hard drive sitting next to the monitor, its blue activity light blinking rhythmically. A label was stuck to its casing, the handwriting neat and familiar, a perfect imitation of his own. It read, Master Backup. He knew with a certainty that defied all logic that this was the final recording, the one Listener X had mentioned, the end of the story. The air in the room was a thick, stagnant tapestry of dust and decay. It smelled of old wood, forgotten paper, and the faint electric tang of ozone from the powered-on computer. Ethan stood frozen in the center of the space, a place that was both alien and terrifyingly familiar. It was his studio. Not a copy, not an imitation, but a perfect atom-for-atom replica, transplanted into the heart of this dead house in the middle of nowhere. The worn leather of the chair had the same crack near the left armrest. The microphone, a Shure SM7B, was positioned at the exact, slightly too high angle he preferred. But it was the computer screen that held him captive. Folders, hundreds of them, all neatly labeled with dates. His podcast, The Shadow Self, had 156 episodes. This drive held over 500. He had scrolled numbly, watching the dates climb past the present day into next week, next month, next year, 2025, 2026, 2027. Each folder contained a single audio file, an MP3 of his voice, narrating a story he had never written, never even conceived of. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This wasn't possible. It was a prank. A staggeringly elaborate, cruel, and impossible prank. But the voice notes Enigma had sent him. They were from these files. The plot twists he'd predicted were not predictions. They were spoilers. With a hand that trembled so badly he could barely control the mouse, he navigated to the very last folder. It was labeled with today's date. Inside, a single file, the last recording.mp3. A cold wave of dread washed over him, so intense it felt like drowning. He knew he shouldn't. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run from this place and never look back. But he couldn't. The need to understand was a physical hunger, gnawing at him from the inside out. He was the investigator in his own stories, the man who always had to look behind the final door. He moved the cursor over the file, the small arrow hovering like a vulture. He clicked. Silence. Then the sound of his own voice filled the room, not from his throat, but from the speakers. It was calm, measured, with the familiar cadence of his podcast narration, but stripped of all warmth. It was a voice narrating a post-mortem.
He woke that morning with a sense of finality he mistook for purpose.
The recording began. Ethan flinched. That was exactly how he'd felt. A clarity, a need to find the source of the IP address, to confront the ghost in his machine.
The drive up to Angeles National Forest was a blur of pine and winding asphalt. He didn't notice the beauty. His mind was a frantic knot of theories, each more elaborate and less plausible than the last. A stalker, a hacker collective, a rival podcaster with unimaginable resources. The truth, of course, was far simpler and far more terrifying.
Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He sank into the worn leather chair, the one that was and wasn't his. His own recorded voice was narrating his life, beat for perfect beat.
The house was just as the GPS promised. Derelict, forgotten, a skeleton picked clean by time. The front door was locked, but a ground floor window, its pane already shattered, offered an easy, almost inviting point of entry. He felt a flicker of fear, the primal warning of trespassing on forbidden ground. But the obsession was stronger. It always was.
The voice continued, its placid tone a horrifying counterpoint to the frantic pounding in Ethan's chest. It described his entry into the house, the dust motes dancing in the flashlight beam, the discovery of this very room.
And then he saw it. The studio. His sanctuary. His creative womb. Recreated in this mausoleum. The sight should have broken his mind right then. But denial is a powerful sedative. He clung to the idea of a prank, a hoax. He moved to the computer, his actions no longer his own, but dictated by a script written long ago. He saw the files. He saw the future, his future, laid out in neat digital rows. No.
Ethan whispered, the sound swallowed by the dusty air.
No, this isn't real.
The recorded voice seemed to answer him.
He searches for the end. He has to know how the story concludes. He finds the last file, the one he is listening to at this very moment. His finger hovers over the mouse, a moment of manufactured suspense before the inevitable click. A character wrestling with the illusion of free will.
Ethan looked at his own hands, splayed on the desk. They felt like foreign objects, props.
And as he listens,
the voice continued, its tone dropping into an even more intimate, chilling register.
He finally begins to understand. He is not the storyteller. He is the story. The voice he hears is his own, but the words belong to another, the true author, the patient listener who has been guiding him, shaping him, for this exact conclusion.
The narration described the rising panic, the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his lungs felt tight and small. It was describing him right now in perfect, excruciating detail.
The recording will end soon, and in the silence that follows, he will be left with a single, unbearable truth. His life is not his own. His thoughts, his obsessions, his podcast, all of it, a narrative construct. And this story requires an ending, a neat, tidy, and tragic ending. He will look at the tools on the desk. He will see the logic, the only way to escape the loop, the only way to reclaim a final piece of agency is to fulfill the prophecy. He will stand up, his panic replaced by a strange, hollow calm. He will end it. Right here. The perfect, psychological thriller finale.
The audio file ended. The sudden, absolute silence was more deafening than the voice had been. For a second, Ethan didn't move, couldn't breathe. Then a raw, primal scream of pure terror was torn from his lungs. He kicked the chair back, sending it crashing against a bookshelf.
No!
He yelled, his voice cracking.
I'm not a character. This isn't my ending.
He had to prove it wrong. He had to break the script. He scrambled for the door, tripping over a loose floorboard, his limbs clumsy with panic. He was a wild animal caught in a trap, chewing at its own leg to get free. He reached the doorway, his hand closing around the cool, rusted metal of the doorknob. Freedom was just on the other side. He would run and keep running, and this whole nightmare would be nothing but a story he'd tell his therapist. Just as his fingers tightened on the knob, a familiar sound cut through the air. Bizid. His phone, in his pocket. He froze, his entire body going rigid. Slowly, with a sense of preordained dread, he pulled it out. The screen was bright in the gloom. A single notification. A new comment on his last episode. His thumb, moving with a will of its own, tapped the notification. The words appeared on the screen. Thanks for playing along. The end.